Okay, I wanted to hit on a couple teams that I don't want to say lay duds because I think the games were a lot different, but had disappointing outcomes. The Chiefs were a heavy favorite on the road against the Broncos, who were terrible. And the Cowboys, I think, was like 17 points. I mean, a massive, massive favorite against the terrible Texans. I want to start with the Cowboys. In general, when you're a good team, I allow you a somewhat of a dud or underperformance late in the season against a bad team. Why? We're all humans. And I know, Belichick for years, right, when he had his really good teams, they could be playing the worst team in the league, be a 20-point favorite, and he would talk about the opponent on a Wednesday like they were the 85 Bears, like they were the 93 Cowboys. You'd be like, Jesus, Bill, this team is 1-13. You're acting like they got 17 Pro Bowlers and their coach is going to the Hall of Fame. And he was great at it. Now, there's a difference between saying that publicly and getting your players to believe it. Because ultimately, like one, thing that's always said just around the sport of football is the eye in the sky doesn't lie. Mean the tape, right? What you put on tape is your resume in the sport of football as a coach and as a player. And you can't watch the Texans and think they're very good. I mean, they were 1-10-1 going into that game for a reason. They stink. They don't have many good players. And when you're the Dallas Cowboys and Mike McCarthy and the coaches, because, listen, having been around coaches, the one thing I couldn't relate, I could never relate to two things. When a player is bad, like trying to figure out how to coach him up, and two, taking bad opponents seriously, like keeping the same level of focus when you're playing the Texans as you would when you're playing the Eagles or the Chiefs, right? That's why most coaches are kind of crazy that way. Players are much more like us normal people, right? It's easy to get up for the big games, the divisional opponents. It's another thing, an uncommon opponent who stinks, like I allow you to not be focused. The only result I care about in terms of judging you is winning the game. Because I remember in 2019 when the 49ers made the Super Bowl, they lost to a terrible Falcons team. So this happens throughout the season. Like you can go 12-5, potentially one of your losses, maybe two of them are going to be when you were the heavy favorite in the game, right? It's not always you're just losing to good teams. You get up for big games. So the Cowboys finding a way to win that game. Now they lucked out. Dak Prescott's arms hit. He's lucky that guy didn't have a clear route to the end zone and walk in a pick six. And then they get the ball basically inside the 5-yard line and they can't get it in. I mean, their play on fourth down was pretty fucking embarrassing. But Dak, who's, let's face it, been a little pedestrian lately, led him down the field. They had a game-winning touchdown. Zeke punched it in, and they won the game. And that's, I'm going to judge them how they look against the Eagles at home. And if they can win that game, then I will take them seriously as a playoff opponent. But I'm not coming to any judgment against the Houston Texans because I know if I was in those shoes, if you listening were in those shoes, probably wouldn't get your best effort. Or maybe not that I don't get your best effort on game day. I don't get your best effort during the week. And when part of football, unlike these other sports, you don't get to play every day. So how you approach the week, like one thing that's cliche, but it's very true, is like your focus, your preparation during the week leads to success on game day. Unless you're some genius. I definitely never was. I had to study to have a chance when I took a test. And even then, I probably was going to struggle to get like a B. But I'm not the most intellectually smart guy when it came to the classroom, right? But if I was going to have success in the classroom, I really had to study. And it was difficult for me. Turns out, I got some learning disabilities. Maybe I can't keep all that. Maybe I just didn't care. Who knows? But part of being a football player is, approaching the week very seriously. And usually when you play shitty teams late in the season, the focus may wane. And then the Chiefs, a lot different than the Cowboys, despite the game being close. They were up 27-0. 27-0. This is not college football. 27-0 in the pros in the first half. I mean, that's the equivalent on a Saturday game of like 48-0. That is blowout city. But then somehow before halftime, they're only up 27-14. But to me, once you're up 27-0, the team, like the Denver Broncos, stink. I mean, they are really bad. Now, obviously, they made this a game. Mahomes turned the ball over. But like I don't have any takeaway from that Chiefs game beside of what I already thought about them is, to me, them and the Bills. And I guess you got to throw the Bengals in there too. Like they're really, really good. All three of those teams can win the AFC. And I'm not going to bet against the Chiefs. I'm not confident they're going to win the AFC, but I'm not going to pick against them in any of the games they play. Against the Buffalo, against Cincinnati, I will go down picking that team. That is going to be my team. And like I said yesterday, if the Bills do make it to the Super Bowl, whether they play the Eagles, whether they play the 49ers, I don't care. The Cowboys, I don't care who they play. I'm picking them to win it. But when the Chiefs play the Bills in the AFC, I'm going to pick them to win the game. Bills, incredible dome team. The Chiefs, they've been through the ringer. They know how to win in a lot of different places, up 27-0, giving them a little bit of the pass. I was thinking about this because, you know, Mike White, who is clearly dramatically better than Zach Wilson. I mean, listen, no one's trying to be mean when we talk about these quarterbacks. Like, it's all relative. You're being judged by really good players. So when people say Tua's not that good or Tua's overrated and Zach Wilson stinks, yeah, relative to top 15 starters, like that's just a fact. And Mike White, you just watch the Jets play. They have a pulse now because of that guy. Now, a little bit, and we'll get into the Niners here in a second, like they're built with defense. They have really good wide receivers who do a lot of their, Garrett Wilson, Elijah Moore, those guys can crush in the short and the intermediate passing game. And obviously their running game is good. And the 49ers, like Brock Purdy in a game and a half has looked better than Trey Lance ever did. And Trey Lance and Zach Wilson went 2-3. But you know the craziest part about that draft is it was fucking loaded. Do you know the guys that came after those two guys? Kyle Pitts, Jamar Chase, Jalen Waddle, Penei Sewell, J.C. Horn, who had a sweet pick yesterday, Patrick Surtain, who's like a faster Richard Sherman, Devontae Smith, baller, Justin Fields, who is clearly better than those two guys, Micah Parsons, Rashawn Slater, and Vera Tucker, who's injured for the Jets, who's also a stud. So this draft was absolutely loaded. And my point of this exercise is the Jets fell in love with this guy who beat absolutely nobody, had one good season, who a lot of people felt like maturity was a question mark. The 49ers fell in love with this guy because maturity was not a question mark, really high-level guy, but his football, based off one season, small level, who knows, who needed a lot of work mechanically. I did the math. The 49ers in 2 seasons since drafting Trey Lance, remember, they didn't just draft him number 3, they traded 3 first-round picks. The 12th pick that year and 2 other first-round picks, those that led to Tyreek Hill and Bradley Chubb. Some valuable assets. And Trey Lance has started 2 games, start to finish. He's played in other games. He came in at a half when Jimmy got hurt. And this year, he got hurt early in the Seattle game. But in games that he started and finished, they are 1-1. The other 28 games they have played, non-playoffs, these last 2 years, they are 18-10. So they're proving that if they could get a redo on that, just like the Jets, they would do a redo. Now, Zach Wilson and Trey Lance have a lot of years left. These guys are 22, 23-year-old guys. They have a lot of career left. Well, Trey Lance couldn't beat out Jimmy Garoppolo because they fixed the job. Like, if they would have had an open competition, Trey Lance would not have been the starter this year. They fixed the job for Zach Wilson. And clearly by midseason, they realized we can't do this anymore. And I guess ultimately what I was thinking about when I looked at this draft and was thinking about this morning is when you force quarterbacks in spots, and the Jets are kind of a poor man's version of the Niners, right? And you have a really good team, it really bites you in the ass. Because think of what those teams could have done with that pick. I mean, the Jets could have traded back. They could have taken these guys. The 49ers could have sat at 12 and taken Micah Parsons. Or hell, maybe they could have traded up, got Jamar Chase, taken Penei Sewell. I don't know, drafted one of these offensive linemen. They could have done a lot of different things. And I think it shows you when you, like, Brock Purdy and Mike White came in, and what Brock Purdy did against Tampa was insane. If you have a chance, go to Brian Baldy's Twitter account, and just watch his breakdown of what Brock Purdy did. It's 2 minutes. It's easy to do. Like that wasn't fake what we saw. And there have been a lot of rumblings in San Francisco. Like Kyle was pretty intrigued with Brock Purdy over the summer. Like Brock Purdy pretty easily won the third string job. And if it wasn't for Jimmy coming back, and let's face it, the reason Jimmy came back is because they had some reservations on the quarterback. They could say whatever they want, but Trey Lance was all over the place. And listen, I understand. I like betting on big, fast, strong arm guys, but that doesn't mean he's going to turn into Justin Herbert. And Zach Wilson was like this raw guy who actually had this great film against nobody with this big arm. And both these teams are absolutely loaded, and they've invested all this in a quarterback. And I would argue that both those quarterbacks are probably not the long-term answer. So the example I'm going to use here is like I talked yesterday about it with the Lions. You don't need to force the quarterback. The Houston Texans, for example, have no choice. They're going to have the number one pick. I would just take Bryce Young. You got to try. But so many teams that have a decent base, like, do you need to do it? Like Seattle, for example. They are going to get the Denver Broncos pick. Just like the LA Rams are going, or excuse me, the Detroit Lions are going to get the LA Rams pick. Take a sweet player. Like, just let things breathe. Unless you believe that guy is going to be, to me, he's got to be at minimum, he has this ceiling to be a top 12 guy, and you believe it. But if you're wrong, it bites you in the ass, and it bites you in the ass fast. Because you can use that on an impact player, whether it's a pass rusher, whether an offensive tackle, whether it's a linebacker, whatever. And you can dramatically help your team. And I think we've seen in the history of the league so many quarterbacks, like Aaron Rodgers wasn't a top 10 pick. He was 24th. Brock Purdy was Mr. Irrelevant. Now, I'm not saying Brock Purdy's going to become Aaron Rodgers. Dak Prescott, 4th round. Russell Wilson, 3rd round. Kirk Cousins, 4th round. We think that all these top picks hit at quarterback. I mean, a couple years ago, that draft, greatest quarterback draft ever. No, not really. I'm recording this before the Monday night game, but we already know what Mac Jones is. Very, very average talent. Zach Wilson and Trey Lance are never going to be as good as Justin Fields. He's just dramatically more talented than both the guys. Now, Trevor Lawrence is a good example. To this day, the Jaguars do not regret that pick. They would 100% take him over. And even he has been somewhat of a roller coaster ride. There was that article a couple weeks ago about Andrew Luck and his retirement, how he regretted the way he handled it. But to me as a player, Andrew Luck is such an outlier. He came to a team that had just been the number one pick in the draft, and immediately they went to the playoffs. And let's face it, looking back at that organizational structure, kind of a joke. They did have some good players, but what he did there is not something that's very normal. So I think teams have to be very, very careful about the hype machine. And the hype machine on quarterbacks trumps every other position by tenfold. And it's easy to talk yourself into it, but when you miss, you regret it immediately. Sometimes, like Jalen Hurts, who might win the MVP this year, was a 2nd round pick. I just think you can find value, and you don't have to force the pick super high if your team is already pretty good. Now, I understand the Jets were not good at the time, but God, do they regret that pick a year and a half later. And last but not least, as of recording this right now, I'm not the most religious guy, but I've been thinking a lot about Mike Leach. And obviously he's, what seems like, just based on internet reports, fighting for his life in a hospital in the South. And let's pray to God that he can make it through this. But some of these reports coming out, I would say, are a little ominous and not the most positive reports. And anytime, you're over 60 years old, you're in a hospital. Hell, I've seen it with, my dad's been sick before he passed away in another situation where it was not good. You never know once you get to a certain age. Anytime you go to the hospital, it's scary. But I do want to just talk about it positively. What an absolute legend this guy is. I mean, I think the coolest part about the sport of football, and it used to be like this in basketball and baseball, but in baseball now the GMs are the stars, coaches don't matter. And when I was a kid in basketball, I mean, there were some huge personalities, from Pat Riley's to Phil Jackson's. Even that is waning a little bit, right? Because it's a front office led sport. Football is still a sport that, through the history of time, obviously the players and the quarterbacks are big stars, but the coaches are every bit as big. And the personalities of the coaches in college and pro football really make this thing that we all love so much cool. and fun and interesting. If we just consider football a big television show, because ultimately that's what it is, Power 5 college football in the NFL, the coaches are absolute major, they play a major role in that television show. And I would say Mike Leach is one of the most unique characters we've ever seen, college or pro. One, he did not play college football. He went to BYU and he played rugby. He got his start, which to me, this always hits home, at Cal Poly, where I went to college. And he just kind of worked his way up. But to me, what's so cool, just kind of looking at his records over the years, is he's never got the shot. And who knows, maybe he never wanted it, and he clearly made a lot of people uncomfortable with the big boys. He's never got some premium job. Ohio State, USC, Texas, LSU, right? These Michigan, Oregon and Washington. These schools were never going to hire him. He went to Texas Tech, Washington State, and now Mississippi State. And you know what he did at all of them? He won. The influence he had on the sport of the spread offense. Historically, I remember being in college, and his offenses at Texas Tech were by far the most potent. And everyone said his quarterbacks do not work in the NFL. So it basically was like an indictment of his offense was like rinky-dink. And at the time, it was somewhat true, but it worked because he couldn't just run the same offense that Texas and Oklahoma were running, or he would have got his ass kicked. So he spread that bad boy out from learning from Hal Mumme at Kentucky, and he lit up other teams like a Christmas tree. And under him, he developed guys like Cliff Kingsbury and Lincoln Riley, who played quarterback for him and then became coaches. Hell, Wes Welker, one of his better players, is now a coach, and I would imagine one day might be a head coach in the NFL. So he influenced the coaching profession. But from an offensive profession, think how many people that you hear talk over definitely the last decade, and I would say even more recently, it is such a positive now to say, yeah, I use Mike Leach's air raid concepts in our passing game. It's like a point of pride. I bet if you talk to Nick Saban, if you talk to Urban Meyer, obviously Lincoln Riley uses it. These guys speak about this guy in reverence for his offensive mind, because when you hear him talk, he doesn't sound, and honestly, he doesn't even look like many other football coaches. But like I said, the thing that was most powerful about Mike Leach is how consistently good his football teams were at non-consistent football programs. At Texas Tech, he never had a losing record. He went 11-2 there one time, 11-2 at Texas Tech, and had them obviously competing to be the number one team in the country when Crabtree beat the University of Texas in the game. Then he went to Washington State. He inherited a team that was 1-11, a complete joke, an awful football program. Within 3 years, he had a stretch. He went 9-4, 8-5, 9-4, 11-2. And he lost to Washington in the Apple Cup, or he would have gone to the Rose Bowl. He had Washington State a game away from the Rose Bowl. And then from there, he goes to Mississippi State, which is clearly probably the worst program in that division. And last year he went 8-4, and he beat Lane Kiffin in the Egg Bowl. Like, you hire Mike Leach, you are guaranteed to win. Now, I understand he's a different cat, and he's not, I don't think he's the easiest to deal with. The year I scouted on the road for the West Coast, it was his first year at Washington State. And I remember going into the school, like, as a scout, it's a little different now with technology, but you'd like go in really early in the morning, like 7:00. And usually, depending on what the football program's doing, sometimes you watch tape for a couple hours, take some notes, then you meet with the coaches, or maybe you meet with the coaches, then you go to practice, then you watch tape. Every school is a little different. But I remember going to the school probably, between 7 and 8. And sometimes the first guys you run into are like the GAs. And I remember talking to the GA, who was actually the guy who LeGarrette Blount hit at Boise State. I forget, I think his last name's Hout. And he was Mike Leach's GA. And I remember asking him, like, where's Leach? He's like, yeah, man, Leach doesn't get into the office till noon. I'm like, till noon? What's he doing? Well, he stays. We have like offensive meetings at like 10:00 and midnight. He's a night owl. I'm like, that's the craziest thing I've ever. Most coaches, Sean McDermott, Andy Reid, Belichick, these guys are getting there like Sean McVay, these guys are getting there like 4:35 in the morning. But Leach gets there at noon. It's like, That's the coolest shit I've ever heard. This guy's a different cat. And then within a couple of years, he had them winning 8-9 games and competing with Washington and Oregon and USC to be the best team out west at a program that has no business doing that. And I'll never forget when Washington State hired him. They asked their AD before they hired him. He had just fired his coach, and they go, "Well, who are you going? What search firm are you going to use?" And the AD said, "The search. You're looking at him. I'm the search firm." And he knew right away. Went after Mike Leach after the Craig James thing happened. He locked him in the shed when the kid had a concussion. Craig James' dad's a complete loser. But that is just it would hurt your heart if you're a football fan if Mike Leach can't make it through. So prayers up for the big guy, and football cannot afford to lose an absolute gem of a human.